just a minute. Good evening on the East Coast, good afternoon on the West Coast, and hello to everybody in between. My name is Nicole Moretti, and on behalf of the Bill of Rights Institute, I want to welcome you to our 5th edition of this, 5 already, of our AP US Skills webinars. Tonight, we're going to cover comparison and argumentation, and you guys ought to be pros at this. Come on, teenagers, you are primed and ready to argue and compare. So we're going to be dealing with the Korean War tonight. I hope that you have all visited the Bill of Rights Institute's website, billofrightsinstitute.org, and our whole goal there is to help you be brilliant and to help your teachers help you be brilliant. And we want you to do really well on this test. So that's what we're here for tonight. Also want to remind you that there's only a couple of weeks left for you to get your essay into the We the Students essay competition that you could win $7,500. So get on that. And with that, we're going to introduce our brilliant presenter for the evening, Mr. Daniel Jocz. A shout out to the LA school system for producing the California Teacher of the Year in 2016 and a finalist for the National Teacher of the Year that year. And we just want to know, Mr. Jocz, if you've been able to get in those walks on the beach.
I do. I get those walks on the beach. Try to get to the beach at least once a month. What's up, everyone? Happy spring break to those of you that are on spring break. For those of you that are about to get a spring break soon, the days, count them down. And today we actually changed it up a bit. We are looking at just the Korean War, because when I was preparing, I realized something. Trying to tackle both those wars is going to be just a crazy headache. And I wanted to focus on Korea because it has a special place in my heart. And so let me start today by just saying I had the honor of going to Korea in 2006. First time I ever left the country, furthest I'd ever been from home. Grew up in Los Angeles. Furthest I'd been prior to Korea was Las Vegas. So I was like super geeked and excited. Got to go to the DMZ. And so there I am, keeping my space between myself and the South Korean soldier that were on duty at the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And the other thing I wanted to share before we officially begin is that within 2 hours of me landing in South Korea, in Seoul, I hit a museum, a music and culture museum, and I made a kid cry unintentionally. It was not my intention to make this kid cry, but they had one of those like little things where you can like play with the instruments and kind of experience these traditional instruments that are a part of Korean culture and history. And this kid was like kind of hogging them all. He was just like hovering over all these instruments. So I just kind of waited and waited for my moment to get one and try it out, just because I was so excited. I'm in a new country. I never thought I would travel abroad. And he kind of went away from the instruments for a cool minute. And so I thought, you know, this is a public space where visitors can go. And I swooped in and grabbed myself that particular instrument and started, you know, trying it out. And the kid just started crying because I had the instrument. Keep in mind, he had 2 instruments still. One he's holding, the other one right behind him. But he was like super bummed out and started crying. I felt kind of bad, but at the same time, I'm like, sharing is caring, yo. And so I put my camera in the hands of someone. I said, hey, can you take a picture of me? So that's actually the picture, one of the first pictures I have of Korea, and the kid walking away, super mad at me. And for the record, I do not recommend making children cry. That's what APUSH is for, not traveling. So thanks for joining us today. If you don't know much about Korea, I hope that you learn stuff. Today, we're going to focus on a war, a very brutal war, a war that has consequences. Even to this day, Korean culture, Korean history, Korean food is amazing. If you've never done Korean barbecue, you need to make that happen. I'm lucky to be in Los Angeles. We have Koreatown. We have a lot of Korean barbecue joints, but the greatest food is bulgogi. Bulgogi, if you're a vegetarian, I guess you can grill lettuce, but bulgogi is amazing. But you can grill all sorts of amazing things. And so hopefully today you learn about Korean history a little bit, but you also learn about Korean food. So get that bulgogi going. So this story actually starts, like we've been doing with all our sessions, we're going to start with some content, and then we're going to practice some skills. So the first thing you all need to know is that Korea has a long history that predates the Korean War. And we're going to overly simplify a few things today. And the first thing we're going to kind of jump into is we're going to just kind of look at what Korea was doing during the war against Japan, Germany, and Italy, World War II. In fact, Korea was actually conquered by Japan as well as way before the war. Up until I think it was 1910, Japan actually colonized this particular region. And after the war was over, obviously Japan loses. They decide to divide Korea up. And north of the 38th parallel, the Soviet Union would take control of that particular region. And that's partly because when the war was over in August of 1945, Soviet troops were actually in North Korea. Remember, one of the reasons why they argue that, Truman was, interested in dropping the bomb to end the war a little earlier was to kind of keep the Soviets out of Asia. So some historians kind of argue that played a role, others disagree. The United States will control the other part of Korea, the South. This division was supposed to be temporary. And this, happens to be the case during the Cold War. If you remember, you have this division, and then the thought would be eventually Korea would be unified. Kind of similar to what was going down with Germany. Germany was divided following World War II and controlled by the US. But in this case, it's not just the US and the Soviets, it's England and France as well. And so dividing things was a big part of this Cold War. Now, a big important thing that you should keep in mind is both the US and the Soviet Union are going to struggle for influence and control of Asian territory. One more time, remember, there was a concern that if the Soviet troops enter the war against Japan in August, as they agreed to in one of the post-war conferences or one of the war conferences, that they would get more influence in Asia. And so when the war is over and we're beefing with the Soviet Union, you're going to have this struggle for influence. Now, real quickly, context matters. You all know that because you're APUSH students. You got to understand the context. And let me give you some real quick breakdown of what was going down when it came to Asia before we get to Korea. And that thing you need to know about is there was a civil war in China. And this is actually the first real engagement for the US in Asia is actually in China. And once again, I'm going to overly simplify this because of time, but basically in China, there was a civil war. It actually was taking place during World War II between two different kind of sides. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek versus the Chinese communists led by Mao. Now, why is this a part of the Cold War if it's a civil war? Well, the United States does not like communism. And so we are giving a lot of aid, financial, especially aid to the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek. Remember, our goal during the Cold War is the C word, containment. And so we are giving a lot of aid to Chiang Kai-shek, but unfortunately, due to a variety of factors, in 1949, that aid is unsuccessful at stopping communism in China, and Mao declares China to be a communist country, the People's Republic of China. Now, there's a lot of things that go into why this happens. It's not necessarily because we failed. Chiang Kai-shek was not really a leader that had broad support. There's a variety of things, but big thing is 1949, China is a communist country. The nationalist under Chiang Kai-shek goes to what is known as Taiwan. You can see there with the arrow, and claims that he is the legitimate ruler of China. What is important to understand in the context of the Cold War is some Republicans and some Democrats even blame Truman for losing China to the communists, that he was weak, that he was kind of losing the Cold War to some extent because this is seen as a foreign policy failure by some. Others argue it wasn't our place to really stop Chinese communism because that's a Chinese situation unique to the circumstances, political, economic, and social that was going on in China. But there's a fear in the 40s, Soviets get the bomb in 1949, China falls to the communists in 1949. There's this fear that we're somehow kind of falling behind in the Cold War. Now, geography. China shares a border with North Korea, as you can see. And remember, at this point, prior to 1949, Korea is divided. And what starts to happen is South Korea is under the leadership of this guy, Syngman Rhee. He is an anti-communist. He is very pro-American. He actually was educated in the United States. And so he gets a big thumbs up from the United States, and we kind of start to kind of consolidate support towards him. We actually sponsor some elections. He gets elected. There are criticisms towards him that he's not as democratic as he claims, but he's our guy in South Korea. And as a result, that's who the US is going to support. If you don't remember his name, you'll be fine. In the North, this guy's in charge, and he has the support of, shockingly, the Soviet Union, Kim Il-sung. Oh, he might be related to someone you might know in the news. And so the Soviet Union is not happy that the US is kind of supporting the Rhee guy. And so there's this kind of resentment. And so they kind of increase even more so the support towards Kim Il-sung, economic, military, and political support. He is a communist leader, and he is the communist regime. Now, what you need to keep in mind is you have these two Koreas that were not supposed to be split indefinitely, but it's starting to look like you get a pro-Soviet and a pro-American government forming. And guess what? By late 1948, bye-bye to the US and Soviet troops. Both countries withdraw their troops. And I forgot to mention, you all, there is a link in the description that gives you kind of a timeline. So a lot of this is already there. I'm a visual learner though, so if you didn't already do so, you can click the link and you'll see most of this information is right there on that Google Doc, and you can add some notes if you want. So I apologize for not remembering to give that plug right there. So the troops leave. The next year, China falls to the communists, right? So you got a communist regime in China, you have a communist regime in North Korea. Americans are a little worried. And then in 1950, something really gets scary to many in the United States because there is a Sino-Soviet Pact signed between Stalin and Mao. They basically enter in this agreement that is officially known as the Sino-Soviet Friendship and Alliance and Mutual Assistance. Look how happy they are about signing this agreement. They're friends. Now, the Soviet Union officially recognizes the People's Republic of China. They don't recognize the government in Taiwan. They provide them with some financial assistance, and they promise to support them in the event of a war. Now, this part's really important. History is complicated, really complicated. Not all communists are best friends forever. And what you're going to learn about later on is a split in this alliance, this agreement, whatever you want to call it. And so if you haven't quite got there, there is going to be a split later on. And this is something that, because they have different visions for the world, they have different kind of goals, economic, political goals. And to the question, why did the US and the Soviet Union withdraw their troops? There was a feeling that these countries are going to need to kind of stand on their own, and we can't have a permanent presence of American troops, but we will continue to support them. So the idea is South Korea is going to be its own country. The Soviet Union is going to support North Korea. They're going to be their own country. And that's the kind of, they're allies with us, but we're not there to occupy them indefinitely. We have a lot of commitments already over in Europe. And so we withdraw the troops. And so what ends up happening next is the Korean War begins when, shockingly, in June of 1950, Stalin gave North Korean leaders the green light to invade South Korea. Now, it wasn't until more recently that we actually found out that Stalin said, you can go for it. Some at the time thought he didn't even know himself, but he did know. And basically what ends up happening is North Korean military supplies and troops invade South Korea. Now, they're doing so with Soviet military equipment, but it is not Soviet troops. It is the North Korean military supplied by the Soviet Union, rolling across the 38th parallel, and you got a war. And this war comes as a big shock to a lot of people. And the guy who's the president in 1950 is this dude, Harry Truman. And the Truman administration really sees this as a test of the containment policy in Europe. That's super duper important. This is the test of the containment policy. What if this is the first of many moves in Asia between these different powers? And so Truman, his goal, his policy goals, and the policy goals of pretty much every president is going to be that policy of containment. And so he calls into session the United Nations, which remember we joined after World War II, unlike World War I, where we don't join the League of Nations, we join the UN, and we condemn North Korea's actions, and we call a vote to condemn these actions in the world community. And remember what happened in the 1930s, when the rest of the world kind of stood by, when people like Hitler and Mussolini and Japan kind of acted aggressively. And what did the League of Nations and the rest of the world do? Not a whole lot. It becomes known as appeasement. Truman feels it is necessary for us to take a stand, or else we will look weak and we will also embolden our enemy, maybe in other places. Now, what ends up happening is the UN ends up kind of condemning these actions, and UN votes, the United Nations votes to what Truman calls a police action. Fun fact, if you're ever on Jeopardy, the Korean War was actually not a declared war. Does not go before Congress. Truman ordered US military forces to support South Korea. And he felt it was necessary to act very quickly because this situation was getting really out of hand. You'll see in just a moment. And he calls it a police action because we're working in conjunction with the UN to maintain order and to try to stop this aggression. Now, take a look at how bad it is, though, boys and girls. There is the map in just a few months after the invasion. That little area in purple is all pretty much that South Korea is controlling, because North Korea takes the capital, Seoul, really easily. North Korean troops are swooping in, and it's a hot mess. Now, you don't actually need to be an expert on the battles and all that stuff. But just to kind of, it's part of the story, part of the narrative, the UN kind of swoops in. There's the invasion. There's this in the purple after the fact. And what happens is, under the UN, the US comes to the defense of South Korea. Now, here's the kicker. Overwhelmingly, I think it's like 85 or 86, some 80% plus of the troops that are actually serving from the UN are American troops. South Korea is doing the fighting, the United States is doing the fighting, and the UN, there's something like 15 nations that are actually participating, but American troops are the overwhelming majority of those soldiers doing the fighting. War is not declared. We go into Korea to basically try to stop this situation from getting worse. To make this story really quick so we can get into the skills, what ends up happening is UN troops under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, you may remember him from World War II, they basically stage a massive invasion at Incheon, and what they end up doing is pushing out the North Koreans, not only from South Korea, but push them all the way up north towards China. And MacArthur starts arguing, perhaps we should go a little further with it. Perhaps our goal should not just be containing communism, perhaps it should be actually liberating North Korea and rolling back communism. Should we possibly unify the Korean Peninsula under a non-communist regime? Look how easily we were able to get them not only out of South Korea, but perhaps we can get them out of North Korea. And this kind of starts to kind of have these two goals. Do we contain communism? Is the Korean War a limited war with a goal that is very limited, stopping communist aggression in South Korea? Or should we roll back communism by not only liberating South Korea, but also kicking them out of North Korea? And that's where this situation gets a little dicey, because China starts making some warnings. And the warnings that China makes is, if you get close to the Yalu River, if you get close to China, we're going to intervene. And that's exactly what happens. The warnings were ignored by MacArthur and US and UN officials, and the Chinese intervened in the Korean War. And Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River, something like 300,000 of them, and pushed the UN forces all the way back down to the 38th parallel. At this point, MacArthur is quite disappointed because the UN troops are driven out of North Korea. He starts publicly calling for an escalation to the conflict. Perhaps we should drop a nuke on North Korea or on China. Perhaps we should send in more troops. He starts talking about widening the war, and Truman's like, time out, whoa, slow down, slow down. We don't want this thing to get bigger than it already is. What if the Soviets enter the war? What if the Chinese stay in the war? What if this turns into World War III? In MacArthur's mind, famously says, in war, there is no substitute for victory, which sounds really cool, right? Why are we fighting just to contain it? Let's just defeat it. But if you're Truman, you also have to be very aware of what's going on in Europe, what's going on in Eastern Europe specifically. And MacArthur is publicly criticizing President Truman, his limited war, his limited objectives, and he's worried about widening it. And eventually what ends up happening is General MacArthur is relieved of command by President Truman. He's basically fired. This was very unpopular for Truman. The General MacArthur was very popular. The American public opinion supported MacArthur because it makes sense. Let's just we're in it to win it. But Truman was worried about the threat of China, worried about the threat of the Soviet Union, and he does fire MacArthur. Politically risky move, but he felt it was necessary. And as a result, what ends up happening is the war slowly kind of grinds to a bloody 2-year stalemate. From 1951 to 1953, there's negotiations going on about prisoner exchange, trying to come up with some sort of agreement to end the war. But for 2 years, the war pretty much stalled around the 38th parallel. In 1952, a guy named Dwight D. Eisenhower is running for president, and he promises that if he is elected, he will end the war. And eventually an armistice was reached in 1953, not a peace treaty. Keep that in mind. An armistice is not a peace treaty. And basically the war is not officially ended, but there is a cease in the fighting. To give you an idea of what this means, a lot of people dead. The blue are the civilians. A lot of civilians on South Korea's side as well as North Korean side were killed. A lot of military personnel killed. And in the United States, we're looking at around nearly 37,000 deaths for a war that has been called oftentimes the forgotten war, the war that's not even a war because it was a police action, a war that our objectives were met. We contained the spread of communism. We preserved the independence of South Korea, but a war that took the sacrifice of 100,000 Americans wounded, not to mention the other forces you will see. If you need proof that the US and the South Koreans did the bulk of the fighting, look at the death toll and wounded tolls for the United Nations troops at the bottom. A little over 3,000 UN troops killed. So that's the Korean War in a short nutshell. Any questions before we kind of say, what might this look like on an exam or practicing some of the skills, argumentation, comparison, and things like that? So I'll kind of pause for a moment, see the chat. Any questions? So I want to, and you can feel free to still launch some stuff in the questions at any point. I want to point out a couple things that I've been kind of saying over and over again. And the first one is this. Make sure you're looking at those key concepts. And if you take a look, one of the key concepts says, as post-war tensions dissolved the wartime alliance between the Western democracies and the Soviet Union, the US developed a foreign policy based on collective security, international aid, and economic institutions that bolstered non-communist nations. This is kind of what the College Board wants you to know. And I just want to show you, just in terms of what I think is a good way to think about the key concepts, is this. Take a look. If you think about what is the policy of collective security, here's our concrete examples from what you just learned about that shows you kind of the way that that manifested in real life. The UN involvement in the Korean War. The Soviets had boycotted the UN Security Council, which allowed the UN to condemn the actions of North Korea. Under the UN, the US sought to stop the spread of communism. So that's an example of collective security, that idea of working within an international body. To Kate's question, how did the Korean War affect US foreign policy? Well, one way is we are extending the policy of containment to Asia. We're committing ourselves to stop the spread of communism in a part of the world that probably many Americans couldn't even find on a map back in 1950. We are doing it in a place where we have no direct, necessarily, economic interest, would be argued by some. And we're doing it through collective security with the UN, under the UN, which is a very big departure from the days of George Washington or Wilson, where we're avoiding entangling alliances. We are very much committed to this idea of containment. And we're also doing it through international aid. So that's also mentioned in the key concept. So another example would be the US provided economic aid to Chinese nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek in his civil war against communist-led Mao. Ultimately, misspelled that aid was unable to stop the fall of communism to China in 1949. So if you got something that talked about to what extent was American foreign policy successful, you can make an argument that, well, it failed when it came to China. Let me show you one more before we practice our skills. Here's another one that's in the key concepts. Concerned by expansionist communist ideology, Soviet repression, the US sought to contain communism through a variety of measures, including major military engagements. So another reason why I felt it was important to go over the Korean War is oftentimes you're in a mad dash at this time of year that Korea gets kind of like, ignored, overshadowed by the Vietnam War. But as we learned, North Korea was temporarily occupied and supported by the Soviet Union. Following North Korea's invasion of South Korea in 1950, the US sought the support of the UN to stop the spread of communism into South Korea. Truman saw the invasion as an extension of Soviet aggression, since North Korea relied on Soviet military equipment to invade South Korea. So that shows you understand this concept. Even though the Soviet Union itself was not invading South Korea, it is seen as an extension of the Cold War because of the nature of the North's reliance on Soviet equipment. And so you will find during the Cold War, we will never fight the Soviet Union directly. There will never be a showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union in a direct way, hence the name Cold War. But we will very often be fighting unofficially in these types of conflicts, as you will see in Korea. So let me show you something here really quickly. And I think it's important as Americans to kind of look at point of view, but not necessarily just within the United States. So these are two quotes from two figures. And I'm going to ask in the chat for you all, because now it's 4:30, so I need you to help out a lot more, to tell me what are these two sources saying? How do they differ with one another? And to source them. So what's going on during the time period? Who are the authors? So I did go quickly. So who are we looking at? What are these sources saying? So let me pause for a moment and give you a sec to kind of take a look at these two sources. Now, if you're wondering why the eye roll animated GIFs, well, I would argue that they are looking at the world from very different lenses. And they would probably roll their eyes if they were faced with confronting the opinion of the other side and the truthfulness of it. So if you take a look at source one, it is a quote from Kim Il-sung, who is the leader of North Korea. He is supported by the Soviet Union. As I mentioned, we didn't know at the time whether or not the Soviet Union, Stalin had given him the green light to invade. We do now know that that was the case, that he was given the green light to invade by Stalin himself. There were some theories that perhaps he had done it without Soviet approval. And if you read the source, his argument is he's actually calling South Korea a puppet of the United States. And he's accusing South Korea of the aggression. And if you look at his words, Kim Il-sung, he is saying the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that they are merely responding to the aggression of South Korea. And they are counterattacking to repel the South Korean invasion. In fact, if you look closely, he will call the South Korea government, the government of Ri, a puppet, not once, but twice. Now, if you were sourcing this on an exam, or if this was a document, obviously you don't have to take everything that a source says as true. Given the fact that this is from Kim Il-sung, who had a dictatorship in North Korea, and he himself was the aggressor here, it would appear that he's playing loose with the facts. On the flip side, Syngman Rhee, who was a guy who had his own set of faults, he wasn't a perfect leader, and South Korea was in no way some democratic utopian society under his leadership. He is, on the other hand, disagreeing with source one, and he is saying that the aggression was the fault of the North. And that the other part that I would say is extremely important here is his kind of acknowledgement that he and South Korea lack the weapons, and that unless the US hastens the delivery of weapons, there appears to be some fear that they were not going to be able to counter this invasion. Now, the reason why I'm showing you these two is this is kind of looking at the kind of perspective of the two leaders, and you can make a lot of connections to the historical context, right? The fact that in September of 1950, South Korea was nearly defeated. The fact that overwhelmingly the support for South Korea's existence was coming from its commitments from the US, military, economic. And so the reason why his country is needed, US support, is very much reflective of that reality. These guys are disagreeing about the kind of nature of what's going on between the two sides, but you can kind of see very different perspectives with the start of this war. Let me show you something else here. You guys are quiet in the chat. I'm getting nervous. Are you testing? Is it because I have a wired headphones and like I'm the only person on in my whole neighborhood with wired headphones that you refuse to talk to me in the chat? Like, because I don't have the cool ones with the earbuds where I look so like hip and stuff. Is this a symbol of my poverty? And now the chat is quiet because like who still has wires? What's wrong with this guy? I'm going to show you some documents real quick here. And one of the things that I oftentimes talk to my own students about is just the process of analyzing documents. And so we're not going to kind of go into the two different kind of wars, Vietnam and Korea. I think that would be a little bit too much to bite off here today. But when you're looking at the documents, there's many different things you will need to do with the document. So the first thing is, what is the document about? You know, and you're not going to ever write this on a DBQ. You're not ever going to, you know, talk about the documents, the meaning necessarily when you're writing a document-based question. But knowing what the document's about will allow you to connect it to the prompt. Yeah, and I figured Korea War was something that a lot of students haven't gotten to yet, which is one of the reasons I want to cover it. but also it's kind of hard for you to kind of talk a lot about it and practice the skills, because if you haven't covered it, you might not feel too confident chiming in too much. Luckily, tomorrow's session, it's all old school stuff, y'all. So come back. So the other one is, can you group or categorize the evidence? Does this document connect to other documents? Is there outside information that you can bring in? And let me just kind of show you when you are actually doing it. I really think it's important to kind of visualize what you're looking at a document. When you're looking at a document, just kind of what should be your priority. So let's just say there's a document here, which we're going to take a look at in just a moment. Quickly in the margins, if you're doing it on paper, what's it about? You don't need to jot this down. How does it connect to the prompt? How does it advance your thesis? Is there a link? Does it connect to another document? And then the outside information, and then hippo or happy. I always argue there's not much happiness in APUSH, so I stick with the hippos. And that's when you look at historical context, intended audience, point of view, purpose, and then organization. So let's actually try this together. Even if you don't know much about the Korean War, you can kind of wrestle with this document right here. So I didn't give it a number because I've moved them out of order. So this is a document, and the first thing I would do is analyze the sourcing. Take a look at it. So this is part of a 1947 memorandum by Francis Stevens. Have no idea who that person is. So sometimes they'll not give you much clue. I don't know who Francis Stevens is. They're the assistant chief of the Division of East European Affairs at the U.S. State Department, or Department of State. And here's where it gets tricky. Is there anything in there, and I'll kind of come back to the chat, is there any clues from the sourcing about what this perspective or point of view or what this document might reveal to us? I'm not giving us a question today, but just kind of analyzing the documents, looking for what they're arguing and comparing them with one another. So is there anything here from just the sourcing that clue you in that this may be helpful? It doesn't even mention Korea, which is crazy, right? Because, all right, well, they're an expert on East European affairs. Well, how the heck is that going to help us with this Korean War stuff? And they're at the US Department of State, which deals with the US foreign policy. It's 1947, so this is before the war in Korea has actually happened. And a little tip. Let's just say this is a DBQ. Who cares what the question is? Most of us don't memorize dates. I don't know most of my dates. Everyone gets mad at me as a history teacher, especially students. Well, you don't know that, you're a history teacher. You don't need to know the dates. You can always look that up. Now on the exam, you can't. But one clue to keep in mind is, let's just say this document is right before this one. And this one actually clues you into when the war happened. So even if you didn't know when the Korean War happened, this document right here from Kim Il-sung, he's talking about that he's talking a bunch of lies, but he is saying that there was an invasion. So that tells you 1950, start of the war. So if you go over here and you're trying to contextualize them, 1947, even if I didn't remember 1950, now I know 1950 was start of the war because that first document tells me that, or at least I can infer that. Now I know this is before the Korean War. And this is from someone I don't know, but they are involved in US foreign policy, but Eastern Europe. Okay. We do know it's 1947, so Cold War is going on, but I don't know much else. So that's the process you start your documents with, trying to contextualize it and think about what might this say and place it within the historical timeline. So yeah, it would definitely be at the time that we are to Scotchy B. I like that. I like that name. That's cool. But yeah, this is during the peak of the Cold War. And let me kind of go over here just because I knew that this would come up. The Marshall Plan is in 1948. No one's supposed to remember that in your brain. The NATO is kind of forming after the whole Berlin situation with the Berlin airlift and the Berlin blockade. But this is peak Cold War is getting off the hook in Europe. Eastern Europe is occupied. But let's just imagine this question is about Asia and Korea. We just don't have a question, but it's about that. Take a look at the document now. Korea is a symbol to the watching world, both of the East-West struggles for influence and power, and of American sincerity in sponsoring the nationalistic aims of Asiatic peoples. If we allow Korea to go by default and to fall within the Soviet orbit, the world will feel that we have lost another round in our match with the Soviet Union, and our prestige and the hopes of those who place their faith in us will suffer accordingly. Once again, I didn't want to give you a question today because I'm more about just the analysis and the argument of the document. There's a couple things here. Before the war. Oh yeah, after the war, Korea was divided. This person, I don't even know if it's a man or a woman, is talking about Korea's importance as a symbol, not necessarily just to Asia, although it does mention that if we let Korea fall to the Soviets 3 years before there's even really a military attack on it, then we will look to the world, forget Korea for a moment, but the Asiatic peoples, which includes Koreans and Chinese, which in 1947 were involved in trying to keep the communists under Mao from taking power. That's actively going on. And we have homies in Europe, Greece, Turkey. Remember, they were part of that Truman doctrine, Greece and Turkey. We have Western Europe, which is falling apart, which is why we put the Marshall Plan into place. And so this is saying that if we don't do something about Korea 3 years before there's even really a military threat, so it's recognizing that there is a pressure because North Korea is currently controlled by North Korea is currently controlled by the Soviet Union. And really what Francis Stevens is saying is Korea is a symbol to the world of our commitment. And it shows, this document shows that the struggle between the US and the Soviet Union spilled over into Asia. And if we don't win, or if we don't fulfill our promises to South Korea, the prestige of the United States would suffer, is basically what Francis Stevens is saying. And then our allies might question our prestige and the hopes of people who place their faith in us. Those countries like Greece, Turkey, West Berlin, West Germany. Maybe that would make them question our commitments. Who are our allies? The countries I just mentioned. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek who are not doing so well in 1947. And so what this document shows us is that our actions in Korea have repercussions for our status as a global superpower. Korea is a symbol of the Cold War, but it's a symbol not just in Asia, it's a symbol in Europe, it's a symbol amongst the nationalists in China, it's the symbol against those who are resisting the Soviet Union. That's the opinion, the point of view, the perspective of this particular document. And if you were, once again, we don't have a question, but you would need to use that to advance some sort of argument. And that's really kind of the thing that you're going to need to start getting your mind to adjust to. Because so much of your A-push experience thus far has been just kind of learning. Now you got to kind of synthesize it and kind of apply your knowledge into some sort of argumentative form. Let me show you something else. I didn't want to cover Vietnam today because of time, but there were a lot of Americans who believed in this idea of the domino theory. And this idea of the domino theory was this idea that just like dominoes, if one country falls, if one domino falls, what happens? What do you think? Just upon this idea of dominoes, what happens if one country falls or one domino falls? I know you all play with dominoes. They're so fun just to meticulously put them all, up in some beautiful design. And then your little brother or little sister comes in and what happens to the rest? Well, let me actually show you a quote from one person I mentioned today. Uh-oh, it's muted. No! This is why we can't have nice things. Technology. Hmm. So scary. Here's the deal. A lot of people believed or kind of talked about this idea of the domino theory. And this is very much kind of this idea, as you all mentioned in the chat, if one country falls, they all fall. One country falls to communism, the rest will fall. And that this fear was based upon this kind of notion of the world that all these events are connected. And before we kind of get into this cartoon and this kind of SAQ practice that I've kind of put together, it's very much kind of seen in even just this cartoon right here. This idea that there's this monolithic movement, this big communist movement that worldwide is seeking to kind of undermine governments everywhere, whether it be in Korea, you see over here, Indochina, Vietnam, Malaysia, Tibet, this idea that these countries are united in their goal of undermining governments that are not communists. And what ends up happening is when China falls to the communists in 1949 and North Korea invades South Korea in 1950, there's this perception that this is all part of this big conspiracy by the Soviet Union and now with the aid of China to try to undermine governments abroad. And what you're going to learn, and I know most of you haven't probably gotten there, is early on, even in the 1940s and 1950s, you're going to have a guy by the name of Ho Chi Minh who's leading a group that some argue is more nationalist and others argue is more communist, but he is the leader of the movement for independence against the French. The reason why I mention this is oftentimes it was perceived as this unified strategic plan. And this idea that Mao and Stalin or Mao and Khrushchev or whoever the leaders were, that they are together devising a plot to conquer the world. And the thing I want you to keep in mind is when it comes to the situation in Vietnam, it's a lot more complicated than that. It's a lot more complicated. Korea is a little bit easier, in my opinion, to understand because North invades South, Soviet weapons, South Vietnam almost about to fall, containment, success, almost led to World War III, MacArthur fired, boom. But the domino theory is, in my opinion, a little bit too simplified in this kind of story of the Cold War. And I want you to take a look at this cartoon. So this cartoon, I should have given you the date. I believe it's like 1947. But if you take a look, it says first, just kind of analyzing the cartoon, countries in Soviet political, economic, and strategic bloc. They are in these kind of colors with the boxes. Countries with communist or communist influenced governments. So this kind of Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, countries under strong Soviet political pressure, countries not yet decided, question marks. You got France with a question mark. You got Sweden. This cartoon, and part one is explain the point of view of this political cartoon. And I do agree that the octopus is very popular in political cartoons. Monopolies and communist takeovers, octopus are they're good for all that stuff. What's the point of view of this cartoon? Before we get into how it kind of connects to Korea, what's the view of this cartoon? This idea that countries, not only in Eastern Europe, are under this external threat, this Soviet threat to impose communism abroad, even in countries as unlikely, at least in probably most people's minds, before World War II was over, places like France. This idea that Stalin was plotting and maneuvering to kind of inject communism into these places, maybe by military force, maybe by propaganda, maybe by economic pressure. Yeah, it's this idea. Now, if all it is anti-communism, you got to go a little further there. This idea that the world was under threat from this communist pressure that was directed by the Soviet Union, by Stalin. That's kind of what this cartoon is clearly implying. And with this kind of countries influence versus under strong pressure, it's kind of, there's degrees, right? Taken over, they're being influenced, and it's still unclear, right? And so the implication of this, because if all you say it's anti-communism, I mean, that could be like pretty much anything in the Cold War. But what this shows you is that there is a call to action to some extent. If there is not yet decided, that means there is a role for America to play in the outcome. And that role could be trying to save France, which, remember, that was part of the whole rationale for the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was intended to provide economic recovery so that places like Italy and France, but also all of Europe, would not be susceptible to communist influence, and communist influence would not grow. It wasn't just the threat of a Soviet tank rolling into town. It was the threat of just people being so economically desperate that communism would be appealing and that people would vote for the communists in elections. So this cartoon is kind of implying that America has a role to play because the continent, the areas are their fates are to be determined. Now, why are we talking about this if the whole thing is about Korea today? But I want you to show how events connect. Look at number 2. Explain one way that the view expressed in this political cartoon will influence US foreign policy in Asia. So this is requiring you to think about kind of what was going on in Europe, the historical process, the phenomenon, and then apply that to Europe or Asia. So what would be a great example of how this view, the cartoonist view here, would be something that could be applied to the situation in Asia? And here's where you could bring in this idea of, well, North Korea invaded South Korea and they were supplied militarily by weapons and financial assistance from the Soviet Union. So while in this cartoon, he's kind of showing Stalin kind of manipulating the situation in Europe, this, if the cartoon was extended going this way, you could maybe see Stalin's foot kind of delivering a tank to North Korea, or Stalin's other foot kind of delivering a wad of cash to the government of Kim Il-sung. And so this idea that these countries, in this case, South Korea, is under threat from North Korea because the Soviets are pulling the strings by providing them the weapons. You could argue that one way that the view expressed in this political cartoon will influence U.S. foreign policy was the U.S. will, under the UN, help South Korea stop communism after North Korea invades, crossing the 38th parallel in 1950. It's not Soviet troops, but part of the Cold War is the battle for control or influence is very often taking place globally. Now, part 3 is the part that if we were looking at Vietnam a little bit closer. So this one actually argues what is one way the Cold War situation in Asia will differ from the point of view expressed in this political cartoon. So what's something that happened in Asia that kind of counters this argument? Can anyone tell me how the situation in China, and I know we went over it very, very quickly, but how the situation in China adds an element to this cartoon that may be contradictory? Because what happened in China was Mao, it's a civil war. And yes, Mao and the communists did end up getting some resources from the Soviet Union, but by and large, the movement in South Korea wasn't controlled by the Soviets or the communists. They are taken over. There's an attempted takeover, but it's not a that would definitely be something you can kind of add. They're trying to kind of impose their will, their influence, and they're doing it through North Korea. But in China, if you wanted to look at number 3, you know, what was going on in China was very much a civil war. There happened to be a side that was communist, in this case, Mao, but it wasn't as simple as Stalin kind of forcing communism in China. And so if you wanted to talk about like an argument that would kind of counter what the point of view is of this cartoon, you can make a strong argument that Mao was a homegrown communist movement. Yes, he eventually gets support from Stalin or the Soviet Union, but by and large, the communists in China under Mao were not a puppet of the Soviet Union. And that's one of the things that, if we go back here for a moment, taking it way back, I mentioned this because Americans oftentimes, and actually, many Americans kind of saw the world, and for good reason, right? It's a chaotic world that we're facing. There was not this kind of puppet-like relationship where these two sides are working together. And when it came to the situation in China, and to some extent what happened in Vietnam, there is confusion where, is this more a nationalist movement, or is this more a communist movement, or is this a kind of mixture of both? And the thing about Korea is our policy of containment is going to be considered successful. And the last thing I'll say before I kind of open it up to any last minute questions is that's not going to be the case in Vietnam. Both wars were undeclared wars. We never declare war against Vietnam. Vietnam will last much longer. But in Vietnam, ultimately, what will happen is going to be very different than Korea, and the outcome will be very different. Vietnam will be unified, but it will be unified under a communist government. And America will leave Vietnam with our objectives having been not met. So hopefully this was helpful. Tomorrow we're going to go more into some old school material. And we're going to be taking a look at continuity and change over time, some turning points in American history. And we're going to also look at this kind of complexity point that is part of the APUSH exam for the DBQ and the essay writing. Just how do you get that complexity point? So we'll be looking at how things sometimes both change and remain the same. If you have any questions, put them in the chat, but that is going to be it for today.
I'm going to give them 30 seconds and see if they have anything they want to throw at you really quick. I want to remind everybody to come back tomorrow. I know lots of you are on spring break or just starting spring break. Hopefully this is worth your time to come back and join us again tomorrow, same time, for major turning points in American history, comparison, causation, continuity, and change, and complex thesis points. Say that really fast. 5 times. Yeah. Okay. Also, let's remind you again that the Bill of Rights Institute website has 4,000 resources, 650 lessons, 300 essays, and more than 300 videos. And they have a lot of primary documents that you could get on and play with if you wanted to practice some of this stuff. So if we don't have any more questions, you guys are all welcome. Thank you. Thank you for being here. And hopefully we see you tomorrow night, same time, same place.